Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are unpacking the fascinating transformation of a rebel polygamist movement into a clean-cut, hyper-American corporate juggernaut worth nearly $300 billion. But at its core, this isn't just a story about money. It's a story about the profound tension between unyielding belief in God and the unstoppable forces of intellectualism and atheism that threaten to tear it all down.
It really is an incredible journey. I mean, we are looking at a masterclass in how an institution builds this impenetrable psychological fortress around the human mind.
Yeah.
Like, it's deliberately engineered to keep secular doubt totally on the outside.
Exactly. And before we get into the actual mechanics of that fortress, I want to take a quick second to say, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
Always a good reminder.
Right. So our mission today for this deep dive is to use journalist Johnny Harris's deeply personal and really historical account of the LDS Church, the Mormons, to understand how high-control belief systems actually function.
Yeah, we're really breaking down how religious dogma gets centralized to fight off atheism and, what that level of control does to a person's psyche.
And I also want to be super clear to you, the listener, right from the jump. The views on theology, God, and atheism we are exploring today reflect the specific source material provided and the author's personal journey.
Right. We are analyzing the mechanics of belief and institutional history here.
Exactly. We are not endorsing any specific religious or anti-religious viewpoints, just impartially looking at how this massive system operates.
And to really grasp the billions of dollars or those historical wars against secularism, you have to start at the very beginning of a single human life. Like, you have to look at the architecture of absolute belief.
Which the source material gives us this visceral timeline of, and it starts incredibly early. At 5 years old, you aren't just learning shapes and colors. You are literally singing, "I am a child of God." You are learning about a tangible, literal deity, and you start paying a 10% tithing on zero actual income.
Yeah, that stood out to me. Johnny mentioned getting his first tiny paycheck working at Dairy Queen, and the very first cut went directly to the church.
Directly to the church. And then by age 12, young boys receive what the church calls the priesthood, which is framed not as a symbolic gesture, but as literal, direct authority from God.
Which is huge for a 12-year-old. That authority is reinforced through constant, structured action. It is a complete ecosystem designed to monopolize time and attention.
Oh, totally.
I mean, think about the cognitive load placed on a teenager in this system.
It's an ecosystem that doesn't let you sleep. You've got high school students waking up at 5:30 a.m. for a religious seminary before their regular public school day even begins.
Yeah, and then Wednesday nights are consumed by youth groups.
Right. And Sundays are strict 3-hour blocks of church where you don't work, you don't shop, you don't watch movies.
And all of this culminates at age 20 when young men, and many women too, are sent on 2-year missions.
Yeah, Johnny was sent to Tijuana, Mexico. He had no media, no music. He was wearing a full suit in 110-degree heat.
Oh, wow. A suit in that heat.
Yeah. And his primary daily directive was collecting rigorous data on baptism numbers, almost like a corporate sales quota.
When you look at that level of intense conditioning, it creates a really stark contrast with how a secular or atheist individual forms a worldview.
Yeah. How so?
Well, in a secular upbringing, a worldview is often pieced together through, cultural osmosis. You might pick up a bit of philosophy from a book, learn a scientific concept in school, hear different opinions on the news. It's pluralistic.
Right.
But in this highly controlled environment, the concept of God is not an abstract philosophical question you ponder. It is an undeniable structural reality that dictates your schedule, your finances, and your clothing.
I'm trying to put myself in those shoes, and it feels like learning a native language.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, it's not like you're an adult choosing to download a new language app on your phone because you want to try something new. This belief system is the foundational operating system of your brain. Every emotional milestone, every family connection is coded in this language of a literal God. If I change my mind about a political stance, I just read a new book or vote differently. But if your entire operating system is built on this literal truth, what actually happens to your brain when secular doubt creeps in?
Well, disbelief, or moving toward atheism, it requires dismantling your entire reality. It isn't just a philosophical pivot.
It's everything.
Yeah, it means losing your community, potentially alienating your family, and shattering the very structure that gives your daily life meaning. The institution intentionally binds the concept of God to every single survival and social instinct you have.
So pulling the thread of doubt threatens to unravel your whole existence.
Precisely, which makes leaving utterly terrifying.
But, and this is where it gets crazy, this highly structured, data-driven, clean-cut corporate environment we're describing, that was not the original Mormon brand.
Not at all.
A church founded by radical rebels somehow transformed into the ultimate symbol of traditional, buttoned-up American values. Like, how did that happen?
It's a classic, desperate story of survival. In the 19th century, early Mormons were radical outsiders. They were deeply mystical. They practiced polygamy, and they literally fled the United States to build their own independent kingdom in the Western Desert.
Right, out in Utah.
Yeah. But they eventually clashed violently with the U.S. government, which brought the full weight of federal power down on them and almost crushed the movement entirely.
So they had to surrender polygamy just to survive the federal pressure.
Exactly.
And that surrender initiated what scholars in our sources call the Hyper-Americanization of the church in the 20th century. They didn't just assimilate into American culture, they pivoted entirely and overcompensated.
Oh, they went all in. They embraced the nuclear family ideal. During Prohibition, they became strictly anti-alcohol, anti-coffee, anti-tea.
And they sent tens of thousands of members to fight in World War I, enthusiastically celebrating the very patriotic myths of the country that had previously driven them out at gunpoint.
Because they had a massive chip on their shoulder. They needed to prove to the world that they weren't just participating Americans, they were the best Americans.
Right.
And that psychological need to assimilate extended to their physical appearance, which they weaponized as a literal shield against public scrutiny.
The aesthetic shift is wild when you look at the historical photos. You go from Brigham Young and these early pioneers with huge, wild frontier beards, which were a proud symbol of their nonconformity and separation from the world, to the mid-20th century under Prophet David O. McKay.
Right. McKay was a totally different vibe.
He was a fashionable, modern man. He championed the clean-shaven face and the crisp white shirt. He systematically killed off the pioneer beard.
Literally killed it off.
Yeah. By the time Johnny was attending Brigham Young University, there was a strict honor code banning beards entirely. You had to look like a mid-century corporate businessman.
But this desperate push to assimilate and become a respected, mainstream American institution brought a Trojan horse right through their front door.
Ooh, what was the Trojan horse?
Modern intellectualism. By trying to beat mainstream America at its own game, they invited empirical science into their ecosystem. And that intellectualism directly paved the way for the threat of secularism and atheism.
Because to be seen as a legitimate force in the country, they tried to turn BYU into the Harvard of the West.
Exactly.
They chased academic accreditation, they brought in highly educated PhDs, they funded massive research departments in archaeology, geology, and linguistics. But when you invite rigorous academic scrutiny into your house, those intellectuals are inevitably going to start analyzing your foundational texts.
Now, the foundational text here is the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith claimed it was a literal historical record of an ancient American civilization, complete with specific geographical battles, names, and advanced technologies.
Which he's supposedly translated from ancient gold plates.
Right. But science looked at those literal claims and said the geology, the DNA, and the archaeology simply do not back this up. It looked entirely like a 19th century invention.
And because the Book of Mormon is considered the keystone of the religion, meaning if you pull it out, the whole arch collapses, this created a massive intellectual crisis.
A huge crisis.
By the 1930s, BYU students and even some prominent leaders were becoming lax. They were reinterpreting the doctrine to survive the science. They started saying, hey, maybe the Book of Mormon is just a beautiful metaphor. Maybe Joseph Smith's visions were purely symbolic rather than historical events.
And this raises a fundamental question about the nature of God and the tipping point into atheism.
Right.
If a religion's founding claims are highly verifiable, like claiming millions of people died in a massive ancient battle on a specific identifiable hill in New York, they're incredibly vulnerable to empirical science.
Yeah, because you can just go dig up the hill and see if there are swords there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the church leadership realized something terrifying. A metaphorical, symbolic God does not inspire a 20-year-old to go to Mexico in a suit for 2 years.
Oh, man, that's so true.
A metaphorical God doesn't get people to pay 10% of their income every single month. If they allowed this intellectual, symbolic interpretation to spread, It would act as a greased chute toward mass secularism and atheism.
Hold on, though. The irony here is that early Mormonism under Joseph Smith wasn't rigid or corporate at all, was it?
Not at all.
Because the sources point out that early theology was incredibly mystical and openly debated. Joseph Smith was preaching about vast star systems where God literally lived.
Yeah, Kolob.
Right. And intelligent atoms that couldn't be created or destroyed but obeyed divine commands. They even had a developing theology around a literal heavenly mother. It was a cosmic, almost sci-fi theology. Why trade that massive imaginative universe for a rigid corporate manual?
They traded it entirely out of fear. The early fluidity and cosmic imagination were beautiful to the believers, but structurally it was incredibly weak against modern academic scrutiny.
Ah, I see.
The more imaginative and expansive the theology, the more surface area there was for science to attack. So in the 1930s, a prominent leader named J. Reuben Clark stepped in and drew a hard line in the sand.
What did he do?
He went directly to BYU and gave a firm mandate to the faculty. He essentially told them that they were there to teach literal obedience, not their private intellectual interpretations. The scriptures were to be taught as literal historical facts. End of discussion.
So he just locked the doors on academic debate.
Completely.
But as the church started growing globally after World War II, largely thanks to all those clean-cut missionaries deployed around the world keeping, that literalism intact became a logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolutely.
Because how do you keep a congregation in Samoa, one in Japan and one in France, from developing their own local cultural interpretations of God, which might eventually lead them away from the core doctrine?
Well, you have to establish absolute corporate control over the flow of information. And in the 1960s, the church executed a sweeping technocratic revolution known as correlation.
Correlation is where the sheer efficiency of this system gets chilling. They centralized all teaching materials.
Everything.
Every manual, every Sunday school lesson, every policy was rewritten in Salt Lake City into crystal clear black and white language. The exact same lesson, word for word, was to be taught in a chapel in Peru as was being taught in Provo, Utah.
It represented a massive consolidation of power. To achieve this universal uniformity, there's a centralized authority exclusively under the male priesthood.
And that had huge consequences.
Right. Huge. The women's organization, the Relief Society, which had a long, vibrant history of financial autonomy, publishing its own magazines and driving social outreach, they lost their independence. All curriculum and finances were brought under top-down male bureaucratic control.
And they built an absolute media empire to reinforce this single, correlated narrative.
Oh, yeah, they had their own film studios.
They produced high-quality, highly emotional films like The Testaments to make the literal history visually undeniable. They were basically bypassing intellectual critique by targeting the emotional centers of the brain.
Very effective strategy.
And they published strict modesty manuals, explicitly warning teenage girls that spaghetti straps and backless dresses were unacceptable, effectively placing the burden of male thoughts onto the bodies of young girls.
Oh, right.
And they formalized patriarchal blessings, where a priesthood holder gives a teenager a personalized spiritual fortune-telling document that they laminate and carry with them to guide every major life choice.
If we look at correlation through the lens of belief versus atheism, it was entirely about building an impenetrable fortress against doubt. To keep people inside this correlated information silo, the institution had to violently demonize any outside information.
They branded anything that contradicted the official narrative as anti-Mormon literature.
Yeah, one leader even infamously called it theological pornography.
Wow. Theological pornography.
Yeah, you were taught from childhood that simply looking at a historical critique of Joseph Smith was morally corrupting to your soul. They excommunicated historians, intellectuals, and activists like Kate Kelly, who advocated for women receiving the priesthood. The message was clear. You do not debate the narrative.
And the ultimate mechanism for enforcing this intellectual and behavioral compliance is the Temple Recommend interview. This is where the psychological control becomes highly personalized.
Let's look at how the temple actually functions in this ecosystem. To Mormons, the temple is not just a regular church building.
Right, it's not where you go on Sundays.
No, it is where you perform the sacred rituals required to get into the highest tier of heaven, and crucially, where you are sealed to your family for eternity.
Yeah.
But you can't just walk through the front doors. You need a barcode card, a temple recommend.
And to get that card, you have to sit alone in a closed room with a local male leader, and he asks you 15 binary yes or no questions.
And they cover everything.
Yeah. Do you sustain the prophet as the only authorized person on earth? Do you pay your full 10% tithing? Are you wearing the specific religious undergarments? Do you associate with anyone whose teachings oppose the church?
It acts as a rigorous obedience checkpoint. If you express theological doubt during that interview, or if you haven't paid your money, or if you've committed a sexual sin, that card is revoked. You are barred from the temple.
The social shame of that is immense. You have to sit out of weekly rituals or even wait outside the building during your own sibling's wedding in front of your entire community.
It's devastating for people.
The crushing threat of losing access to your family in the afterlife, combined with the immediate public shame in this life, is the glue that holds the literalism together. And that threat of losing your family isn't just a psychological tool, it's a massive financial one.
Very much so.
Because question number 2 on that interview is about tithing. The shame literally funds the institution.
Which brings us to the most tangible, staggering byproduct of this entire correlated system. When you successfully create a global machinery of millions of people who literally believe that paying 10% of their income is a rigid prerequisite for eternal salvation and family unity, you generate unprecedented tax-free wealth.
Yeah, in the 1970s, the church realized it needed to professionally manage the absolute river of tithing coming in. They brought in corporate titans like N. Eldon Tanner, a former Canadian oil tycoon.
He applied fierce, ruthless financial discipline to the church's ledgers. He established a rule that they were not just going to spend tithing on building chapels or printing manuals, they were going to systematically invest the excess.
So they hired elite Wall Street professionals and diversified heavily into stocks, bonds, agriculture, and commercial real estate. Fast forward to today, and the LDS Church is widely considered the wealthiest single religious organization in the world.
It's mind-blowing. They are sitting on an estimated hedge fund of over $100 billion, with total assets crossing the $200 billion mark.
Walmart doesn't even keep that much cash on hand. And the craziest part of the data we're looking at is how they spend it. Roughly 65% of their massive expenditures aren't going to humanitarian aid, charity, or even building new churches.
No.
65% goes simply to reinvesting into the fund to grow the wealth even more. It got so massive that they actually set up illegal shell companies just to hide the sheer size of their cash reserves from the public, which resulted in a massive multi-million-dollar fine from the SEC.
This astronomical wealth creates a fascinating psychological split, depending entirely on your worldview, particularly when we examine the divide between absolute belief and secularism.
Well, yeah, because if you are a devout believer living inside the correlated information silo, how do you view a $200 billion portfolio and an SEC fine? You don't see corporate greed or financial manipulation.
Not at all.
You see undeniable, miraculous proof of God's blessing on his chosen people. You see prophecy being fulfilled in real time. You see a divine rainy day fund perfectly managed to prepare the world for the second coming of Jesus Christ. For the believer, the sheer size of the wealth validates the truth of the faith.
But if you step outside that silo, if you are a secular critic, or perhaps a member who is painfully transitioning out of the faith and grappling with atheism, you look at those exact same financial ledgers and see something entirely different and, frankly, deeply unsettling.
You see a corporate behemoth that has successfully weaponized existential fear.
Exactly. You see an institution exploiting its members' terror of eternal damnation and family separation to quietly amass an untaxed, unregulated investment portfolio.
It's two entirely different realities built on the exact same data points. Which brings us back down from the billions of dollars in the hedge funds to the actual human mind. What happens when an individual, like the author of our source, Johnny Harris, finally leaves this all-encompassing system?
It results in a profound psychological unraveling. When your entire identity, your vocabulary, your social network, and your very concept of eternal worth are dictated by a centralized committee in Salt Lake City, stepping outside of that structure isn't just a change of habit, it's an ego death.
Johnny describes an ongoing, painful struggle over the last decade, just trying to rewrite his basic understanding of personal worthiness.
It's incredibly difficult.
When you are taught from the age of 5 that you are a literal ambassador for God, and that your fundamental value is tied directly to your obedience to a corporate structure, redefining your worth based on what's actually inside of you, that's a massive undertaking.
And leaving is complicated by a deeply complex entanglement. The psychological harm done by the institutional control is inextricably woven together with immensely positive, beautiful traits.
Right. He talks openly about how his insane work ethic, his profound curiosity, his fluency in Spanish from his time in Mexico, his deep kindness, and his fierce focus on family, all of those things were installed by the exact same machinery that controlled his mind.
It's an impossible paradox.
Yeah, you can't just surgically remove the trauma of the control without acknowledging that the church built the very foundation of the person you are today.
It really highlights the ultimate power of a correlated, centralized institution. It doesn't just ask for your weekends or percentage of your money. It claims total ownership of your internal narrative.
As we wrap up, I want to remind you, the listener, that this deep dive reflects the source material's specific historical and personal critique. Our goal today wasn't to take a side in the grand debate between religion and atheism.
No, not at all.
Our mission was to explore the incredible, awe-inspiring, and sometimes terrifying power that an institution can wield over human identity.
We wanted to understand how belief is constructed from childhood, how it is fiercely defended against the threat of doubt, and the monumental billion-dollar structures required to maintain that literalism in the modern world.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We've talked extensively about the architecture of belief, the corporate control, and the billions of dollars. But think about your own mind for a second. If your deepest values, your work ethic, your kindness, your very definition of family are programmed into you by a vast external system, how much of you is actually you? And if you ever decide to strip that programming away, what exactly is left behind?